Yeah, I
Okay,
think
great.
yeah, we can we can start. I guess I'll kick off. Welcome everybody to kind of like the fall edition of the Tokyo Cybersecurity Meetup community. Sorry, we've been kind of quiet the past few months since our summer event, but it's been, I think, a little hectic for everybody, which is good, I think, for in all industries. Just want to welcome a lot of our regulars to today's session, as well as I see a lot of new names, and I think I was checking the registration. There's a lot of new people, so to the first timers, welcome, and hopefully you guys can join us in the next events. We'll continue to generate these events for the community in Japan and of course in APAC and all over the world as well. I also just wanted to mention that since the restrictions in Japan are a little bit less strict, we're targeting to hopefully, fingers crossed, arrange an in-person event. So I wanted to create a poll for the people in Tokyo specifically. So please, it would help us. If that could be something that you can answer at some point. And then also, just encouraging everybody to ask questions at any point in the event. We encourage everybody because I know the panel wants to, answer any questions that anybody has. So yeah, I guess like without further ado, I will stop talking and I will pass the mic to our resident co-host Thomas. So.
Thanks, Gino. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Tokyo Cybersecurity Meetup online edition. I guess we've been online for over a year now. And as Gino mentioned, we would be keen to try and go back to face-to-face in Japan if there are interest among those of you who are based here. But otherwise, the online edition is actually great because we're able to have speakers such as Jason in Singapore, and also I'm aware that we have people joining from all over the world with us today. So just to get straight to it and kick things off, we're very happy to have Clarence and Jason joining us today. So I'd like for the both of you to first start by introducing yourselves, giving us a bit of background about who you are, what companies you're representing, and just a bit of context about what you're doing in the Japanese market. So Clarence, do you want to get started?
Sure. Thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Gino. Thank you for the opportunity. Great to at least virtually meet some folks here on the meetup. So my name is Clarence Cheah. I am Senior Director for Okta's Asia Pacific and Japan business expansion. So in this role, I'm really helping accelerate our growth in the region. So a bit about Okta. Okta was founded back in 2009, born and built in the cloud, and we're an identity company. So essentially, our mission really is to try and connect people to the technology that they use. And we want to help take away the challenge, take away the concerns around security. We help accelerate, cloud transformation, cloud acceleration. We help organizations, run faster and accelerate their digital transformation. And of course, we do that by laying down a strong zero trust-based security architecture to do so. So that's in a nutshell about Okta. Hopefully you'll find out a bit more over the course of today, but happy to network and chat more about Okta if anyone's interested. And I'll pass it to Jason.
Yep, thanks, Clarence. Thanks, Gino and Thomas, for having me as well. So my name is Jason Teo. As you can tell, I'm based out of Singapore. I head up business development and partnerships for Secret Double Octopus in APAC, and that covers both APJ, Asia Pacific, Japan, all the way to the Middle East as well. About the company, Secret Double Octopus, we're a leader in passwordless, and more specifically, I guess, as a cybersecurity firm, we're here to save the day, right? And save the world. But in this case, from the pains of passwords, and we'll definitely want to share more about that as we talk. Back to you, Thomas.
Great, thanks both for the introduction. So what's interesting for me on this topic is authentication is something I think that we all take for granted. It's also not a topic we've actually delved into very deeply, at least in the discussions that I've moderated as part of the Tokyo Cybersecurity Meetup. So I definitely think we're going to have a lot of interesting insights today. To get started, I'm aware that a lot of the people joining us are quite familiar with the concept and perhaps are well involved in the cybersecurity industry, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, it'd be great if you could both start with some general definitions related to authentication. So first of all, maybe Jason, if you could give us an overview of what multi-factor authentication is and why is it important, that would be, I think, great to kick things off.
Sure, absolutely. So multi-factor authentication, or MFA for short, is really the idea, right? The idea behind it is really about having more than one factor or one proof of identity. So having one identity, one proof is not enough. We believe that it's better to have more, right? So that we can ensure that it's Jason, for example, logging in, and it's who he says he is. And these factors or these additional proofs of identity typically fall into one of these three buckets. It could be something you know, and that's something like a password, a PIN, a pattern that you fill in. It could be something you have. So many of us have smartphones. It could be a hardware key or token. And it could be something you are, and that's usually a physical attribute, which is biometrics. So it could be a facial recognition, thumbprint recognition, etc. Right? So it's a combination of two or more of these factors. Yep.
And I'll probably add a bit to that. So I think that's the fundamentals of the multi-factor authentication, the three combos there. And over the last 10, 15 years, I think the industry and technology has evolved quite a bit. So now it's not the three. It used to be like 2FA or 3FA, but now we have a multi-factor. So I think the dimensions of what else you can include in this multi-factor is also rapidly changing. So things like who you are. So before it's like biometrics, your thumbprint, your retina scan, and all that. But these days also things like can I pick up your behavioral patterns, right? So what you're doing in session to how you are typing your password into the login box. So these are some of the behavioral type patterns where we're seeing a lot more techniques are trying to incorporate some more advanced contextual data into this flow. So I'll just add that a bit of a sprinkle of innovation into that as well.
Thanks. And I think probably one of the most important factors out of this is passwords. And you both mentioned in your introductions that there is a new trend about going passwordless. So if you could just provide a bit of background on what does that mean to go passwordless, and why should I stop using passwords?
Well, Jason, since you're the subject matter expert on this, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thanks. Well, for us, increasingly all of us as users of passwords, we recognize that passwords, first off, started as a solution, right, to help us all authenticate and log in. But of late, it's becoming increasingly a problem for all of us, for companies, etc. Right? So beyond, user friction and productivity issues with respect to losing passwords, resetting it, or forgotten passwords, there's obviously an element that's causing a lot of frustration for companies all around, especially during COVID-19, where it's a lot harder for IT organizations, right, to help the end users with all these challenges remotely, right? But for us, a bigger issue at hand is the fact that, a vast majority of data breaches today are actually caused by passwords, right? It's either a weak password, it's a stolen password, it's a reused password, or a compromised password, right? And that's a huge surface area of attack, right? That's coming from the bad guys. And, because of that, we take a very strong opinionated view that, the passwords are really at the root of this problem. So when I define passwordless, I actually go out there to emphasize that it's really the elimination of passwords, right, from end users. so that they don't need this as a factor of authentication. There are other better methods of doing so. Clarence, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with all the points. But I'll add to that as well. Password became so popular because it was just a very cost-effective way to roll out authentication, right? I think the challenge is over time, we've really built too much dependency on passwords on one hand. And on the other hand, I think we've also been slack or lazy on how we implement best practices or controls and how to protect it and make that whole experience a lot more secure. And you made the point around usability. If I poll the people on the call here or anyone in the company, majority of people hate passwords, right? It's a bit of a usability challenge. So I think going passwordless, not only is it a big win from a security perspective, I think it's a big win from the user perspective as well. So it's a good win-win thing that, it's something that it makes a lot of sense. But to me, it's also, password is a factor. I don't know why that it always has to come first, right? Why do we always have to put a password first and then the second factor later? So to me, I think it's time that we rethink a number of these things and to really, reconsider the current environment that we operate in, the usability expectations, and rethink all of this. And passwordless just makes a lot of sense.
Great, thanks both for providing some color into that term and concept. I think another buzzword that is thrown around a lot with regards to authentication is the idea of zero trust. I know this is not just unique to authentication, but I know it's definitely something that I saw from both your respective companies' websites and marketing materials. So we may discuss the term in more detail later on, but so that everyone is familiar with what this means, if you could just provide a background as to what zero trust is and why it has become such a popular term, I think that would be very useful for the audience.
Yeah, so I'll probably jump in here for Jason. I think zero trust has been a term coined for quite some time now. Google used to call it Beyond Corp, and a number of different wordings used, but really the core concept is never trust but always verify. So I think there's a lot of false sense of security or controls being put around ring fence of things that is not effective in today's compute environment anymore, right? So you look at the rise of mobile computing, cloud computing, and a bunch of stuff. So before, when you used to have security controls around the firewall and perimeter security, a lot of that is no longer effective, right? Add to the fact COVID-19, remote work, now all of a sudden, things have really changed. So, this is really has evolved for some time. And really, I think the last 2 years has really, put an accelerator on really looking at, zero trust more seriously, especially in the context of like remote work and also planning for this in the future as well, because I think remote work is here to stay for some time in some form. So I'll just start with that, Jason.
Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with everything you said. I think for us, if we look at zero trust, I think it really comes from, the previous mentality that most companies had about it's kind of like it's a castle or it's a fortress, right? We're trying to protect our perimeter and stop the bad guys from coming in. But as Clarence alluded to, all these new developments and changes, right? Whether it's cloud computing, bring your own devices, and now with COVID-19 as well, the whole concept of working remotely and sometimes through personal devices, right? So how do you handle things like people using personal PCs, personal tablets, phones, etc., right? Accessing corporate assets. Your whole idea of the perimeter is no longer clearly defined. It's stretched in so many different ways. And because of that, I think that's where people or companies are starting to have a rethink and going back to, if it's going to be so porous, why not focus about validating or verifying at each area, right? Instead of just doing it at the perimeter. So it's going back to that whole trust, but verify. But don't forget, that process, unfortunately, also means for many companies, the addition of a lot more passwords, right? I think the average user today probably has more than 100 over passwords because of the vast number of apps, etc. And that's proving to become, another challenge, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But I think the word zero trust, at the end of the day, you need to trust something in order to grant access to something, right? But it's that, as you said, Jason, the verifying thing and removing some of those dependencies that should no longer be there. I think that's the key. Like for us, we're a bit biased, but we're an identity company. But I do think that identity is kind of like the only perimeter or the most important perimeter to protect. Because if you can't protect your users, if you can't authenticate them properly, hopefully with less passwords, then it's really hard to build that trust from that point on, right? So I think as a last perimeter of defense, and the most important one, we really need to make sure that the users and identities are authenticated properly, and then rebuild that layer of trust on top of that. So I think that's even though I think it's a zero trust, it sounds like a very sad kind of world that we'll live in. But I think the whole idea is just to review and relook at how do you rebuild that layer of trust, from what your foundation should be.
Great, thanks. I think it's interesting what Jason mentioned about the wider attack surface, and also what Clarence was talking about just now about why do we need to live in a kind of zero trust world. So I want to ask a bit more about the threat landscape with regards to authentication, because we all know that in many cases malicious actors have been stealing passwords and misusing passwords for almost decades now. But if you could provide a little bit more color as to the types of attacks that that you're seeing and that your organizations are helping to defend against, I think that would be useful to understand what is at stake and the severity of this situation.
Yeah, I think when it comes to cybersecurity and the threat landscape, I mean, where do you begin, right? There's so many different attack vectors. There's so many evolving threats. As long as there's innovation in technology, as long as there's business demands to do things and user expectations, there's always going to be different things we need to fix and different things we need to lock down, right? And as you mentioned, Thomas, I think passwords, I think the latest cybersecurity incident report published was like 61% of, the Verizon data breach report, 61% of all breaches involve some sort of stolen credential, right? So that's a very high percentage and a very common attack vector. And if you think about it, then the last 2 years, we've really shifted, like remote work, work from home and so forth. There's also another brand new attack vector there where, your employees at home are basically sitting ducks, right? They're connecting from a network that you don't have no control for. Hopefully, what the device is, and hopefully you've educated them on what are the good security practices, what to and not to do. So all of a sudden there's a brand new attack vector, and old techniques that we used to use, and also the old infrastructure especially, you see a lot of these kind of attackers targeting and specifically pinpointing what legacy infrastructure that you're running, and also use them as a good starting point, because these are the ones that you may not be able to apply some of the more modern protocols or more modern security patches and so forth. So they're also looking for these type of legacy stuff to start. So yeah, it's I can ramble on for a lot more, but there's definitely plenty of targets out there.
For sure. I mean, just adding to that point, I think there's certainly a lot of, I think it's prioritizing and focusing on where the largest surface area of attacks are. And to your point, right, the fact is that with many people now working from home or working from anywhere, right, in a hybrid working environment, if you just focus on the areas that you can control, if you think about it, companies are investing a lot in endpoint security, EDRs and a lot of other good stuff that goes onto their laptops and workstations and all that. But if you don't know where your employees are and who's with them and how safe those laptops are, maybe you should consider, even protecting, desktop logins, right? As an example. Because at the end of the day, as we spoke about earlier, the fact is that, many of these practices, security practices that we, as IT people have imposed on our end users, have inadvertently caused them to build up some, unfortunately, bad habits, right? Because companies, because we have to rotate our passwords frequently, we can't reuse or share them. They have to be complicated. Therefore, it makes it hard for people to remember them. So that's creating some unfortunate side effects, right? People or employees, which unfortunately could be the weakest link in this entire scenario, are writing passwords down, right? You've seen the proverbial post-it pad, or people are going digital. They're keeping passwords in Excel spreadsheets, etc. But it's still not safe. It's a bad practice. And people are starting to share passwords, right? Not just within corporate, but externally in their social network or other consumer apps. And then lies the problem. So if we can take that burden, I feel, away from these end users, then it stops and discourages them from trying to do something, that's bad for the company, right? And that helps us keep it under control. Because the more difficult things are, the more user friction, the more lack of usability there is within our systems. We're just making the end users find ways to try to beat that system, right? Or to try to work around the system. And that's something that it's harder for us to control.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I want to share a story, and then I'll make a point on that. So bad policies encourage bad behavior. Totally agree. The post-it note, as you said, right? You make them set complex passwords, so write it down, right? Or even share it with others who are sharing an account. So that's another bad practice. Well, I'll share a story with you where, there was a customer a while back where they created a brand new directory where they, uploaded the users in, and they were very happy with the new infrastructure that they've got. But the problem was they also had that, the good old security practice where please reset your password every 3 months, right? And by the way, it can't be the same password as the last 10 passwords you've had. So 3 months gone by, and they were getting this spike of password. So the servers were actually being hit. They thought they were getting a denial of service attack at some point. But what has happened is the end users all had the same password expiry time. So they all had to reset their password, and they were all resetting the password to something else 9 times and go back to the original password, right? After setting it. So you get this huge load of password reset attempts driven by just, a badly implemented policy. Anyway, I thought that was quite a funny thing to share, because we were brought in to look at the performance tuning and all that. And, well, hang on a second, why is it only happening at that one point? But I think that the whole key message there is, if there's one thing that you take away from what I'm saying, today, and there's one thing that you can do in the short term, either get rid of passwords or really remove your dependency on passwords. I think that's the key underlying thing. Anyway, sorry, I just couldn't help myself sharing about that incident.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting story, and actually, I'd be curious to know, Clarence, you mentioned I think it was the Verizon report or something that cited that 61% of attacks are related to some kind of stolen credential. I mean, can either of you give any more specific examples of maybe some major incidents that have been the result of some compromised credentials, for example, passwords?
Yeah, I think there's a lot out there. A lot of them actually involve some sort of a password or credential attack. And as I mentioned, a lot of these hackers are targeting either weak entry points where, legacy systems where you haven't really secured properly, or have those security, holes and so forth. And sadly, we see that, time and time again. It's not an easy thing to really take audit and review all the different threat vectors that exist. And I think that, to me, the password-based attacks are probably the most commonly successful attempts in my observation. Jason?
Yeah, thanks. Just adding to that, actually, there was a recent event that happened earlier this year that was in the news, right? It was a big one. It's Colonial Pipelines in the USA. Colonial Pipelines, for those who don't know, is one of the largest oil and gas, right, suppliers in the United States, and they were hit by ransomware, right? And they paid, I believe, 4-point-something million, right, out in to the bad actors. And post-event, when they were kind of like doing a post-mortem and trying to figure out what's going on, they discovered that, interestingly, the bad guys got in via the company's VPN, right? Somehow, the bad guys got access to the credentials. So there was no MFA, there was no additional protection, right? On VPN, it was just a simple password. And somehow the bad guys got access to that password. And abused something which all of us take for granted as a secure tool, right? A tunnel that allows you to connect from outside the public infrastructure to your corporate assets. Unfortunately, the bad guys took advantage of that same tunnel, to go in there and implant, right, a ransomware or some malware within the company. Now, investigations are still ongoing, and it's hard to, figure out, like, how the credential was obtained, as an example. But one thing that they did find out, that credential happened to be one of those common passwords that was stolen, right, in the dark web, and that was previously used for some other, some other consumer website, right? So it was actually a reused password that the bad guys got hold of, and unfortunately abused, right, to get to Colonial Pipeline. So I think it's important sometimes to take a step back and relook at what we have, because certain things that we take for granted, even something as secure as VPN, could unfortunately be abused, right, or by the bad guys, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think some of the bigger names make the news, but from what we've observed so far as well, it's not just the big guys that are being attacked. In fact, I think 50-60% of the attacks are also targeting the small and medium businesses. And it's also not just one attack, but repeat attacks on the same victim are also super common, right? And also, not only are they targeting the, some of those more prominent industries like financial services or healthcare or some of those, but no industry is immune either. We've seen attacks on agriculture, higher education, of course, retail, manufacturing. A lot of these are increasingly being targeted, and I just think that even from a cyber insurance standpoint, it's really super hard for a lot of these organizations to really take out insurance or protection against these sort of attacks. It's that bar is increasingly being lifted as well.
Yeah, definitely. You've both highlighted the severity of this kind of type of attack and the scale and the impact of something as simple as a password or attacking an authentication system. I just want to focus now actually on the implementation, because you've both given an overview of what different authentication systems and what a zero trust environment is, but how does it work in practice? How do organizations actually say, I want to implement some secure type of authentication? What are the challenges around this? Because having this across especially large organizations, or even probably a small business that's not so tech savvy, may be a big challenge as well. So it'd be great to hear some insight from you on this.
Jason, do you want to?
Sure.
Preface?
Yeah. Yep. Why not? So I think one simple example, that we talked about, given that passwords, obviously are a liability for many companies, is that companies can easily add or layer on additional security tools, right? So with respect to passwords, I think having an MFA solution would be something that is almost mandatory, right? In fact, speaking to your point about cyber insurance, in the US today, we are seeing a huge take-up of cyber insurance. So companies, SMEs, larger firms, they're buying, insuring themselves against, all these attacks. And interestingly, one of the essentials that cyber insurance firms have been mandating for these companies are to have an MFA policy, right? And it's not just necessarily on the desktop, but it's also, based on zero trust across all the other corporate assets that they might have. So I think as a first step, certainly having an MFA is much better than relying on passwords alone. That said, I think I also want to emphasize that, again, MFA is an idea and a concept, right? The idea is good. The implementation is evolving. Many of us know and use MFA systems that, for example, rely on sending the OTP by SMS or email. But cybersecurity experts today have basically came forward to say that, look, SMS and emails, not exactly the best medium, right? Because, a lot of our mobile numbers get recycled, but also because the hackers are getting smarter, right? There's a lot more man-in-the-middle attacks. There's a lot of SIM card swapping, etc., that make it inherently unsafe. So I think the industry is also on a whole moving towards newer forms of MFA, whether it's a software push, etc., right, to avoid some of these issues that they have traditionally. Over to you, Clarence.
Yeah, I think when it comes to things like passwordless, MFA is a great layer on to protect that authentication flow. But I think passwordless has been around for quite some time, right? You've got curve loss-based authentication. You've got all these kind of techniques. It's not about enabling it. It's more about how do you securely and responsibly enable it. Because when you go passwordless, you really have to fall back on the other authentication techniques that are secure and deployable and usable, right? So for that to happen, you really have to take into a lot of consideration. Fortunately, in today's technology landscape, there's a lot more of these that we can take advantage of. You just take, for example, the mobile computing space, right? I remember being involved, there was a huge uptake of, everyone's building a mobile banking, everyone's building a mobile app. And then you got all these banks that were rushing towards, hey, we need to build one and we're going to put, a pin over it so that they can use the same pin as their credit card or their ATM card. We're going to get rid of passwords. And so they did all that. And that was done like 10 years ago without all the technology that we have today. Today, we're fortunate that, you've got the Face ID, the Touch ID and all that developers can now fall back and call these kind of APIs to really leverage the software and hardware vendors to actually provide some of these native technologies that can help them, right? So I think if you're building a mobile app and you're not thinking about these kind of techniques, it's a real shame that there's a missed opportunity. I still see a lot of mobile apps with, launch the app and enter your username and password. And it's like, don't you remember who I am? And can't you let me log in with my face and my thumbprint? I think there's a lot of technology that can be leveraged. So we really have to look at not just the security side, but the usability side. And also, don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of things that has been invented, standards you can follow, or, I think there's a lot of leverage that we have today compared with, 10 years ago that weren't available.
Great, thanks for those questions, those answers regarding the implementation. Before I follow up with that around the situation here in Japan, just to kind of let the audience know that I'm reading your questions and I'll allocate some time at the end for Jason and Clarence to address those. And if you do have any other additional questions, please use the Q&A feature in the webinar. because it's easier to manage. But otherwise, I'll just read what you're typing in the chat as well. But yeah, if you do have any additional questions, please let us know, and we'll try to address as many as we can later on. So coming back to Japan, given that this is the Tokyo Cybersecurity Meetup, how have the both of you seen the adoption of authentication approaches in the Japanese market? Or what did you see when you were going in? What was sort of, let's say, an established or traditional approach, and how have you seen this evolving, particularly as the COVID-19 pandemic was kind of a shock to many organizations here that maybe weren't as prepared to offer or provide an environment for distributed work?
Yeah. I'll probably make a few observations, and some might be controversial, and maybe some of the audience might challenge me on that as well. But I've been living in Japan now for about a year, but I've been working in the region for some time. What I've noticed, there's a big contrast between a lot of the techniques that is preferred in Japan versus in some of the other parts of the APAC region. I'll take one very simple example: devices. There's a very strong preference in Japan to not allow for BYOD. I think there's a lot of culture where you can only access corporate resources from a corporate issued device. And BYOD, instead of buying solutions to address BYOD requirements, a lot of customers are looking at solutions that prevent someone from accessing from a private device, right? So it's actually the exact contrast. And so when the pandemic hit, and when you had remote work and you had like very short time to respond to a lot of these things, it became a big challenge because a lot of now you have to open up the network for remote access. That's number one. And second, you need to just prove that you're using a corporate issued device and not anything else. So that was a lot more to figure out versus a lot of the other regions where, we've been doing BYOD for a number of years now. The productivity could continue, and there were a lot more options to work around that. So I think that was one. And a following point from this, and this is going to be the controversial point, is I feel that there's a more leaning towards stringent security policies that make sense about security. There's actually less consideration on the user and the usability side. That's my general observation. In a lot of the policies and a lot of the implementations tend to steer towards that path. And for me, I think, if you want a security implementation to be successful, you really need the end user on your side as well. It's not about the implementation; it's also about the adoption and also the enablement and the practice that you build on. So that's I think my high level view on some of the authentication differences and some the kind of approach that I see Japan versus the rest of the APAC region.
And Jason, I'm mindful that you're obviously in Singapore, but based on some of the work you've done with the Japanese market, how have you seen some of the approaches to authentication here versus maybe Singapore or elsewhere in APAC?
Yeah, I think adding to what Clarence has said, I think sometimes when we are in developed countries, I think we are quite honestly very fortunate. Because the infrastructure is so good, right? That allows us a lot more options. If we compare that, right? If we contrast that perhaps with the rest of Asia Pacific, right? Outside of Japan, you have countries with much weaker IT infrastructure. Not everyone has fiber or broadband to the home, and people have also, different living conditions as well, right? They're squeezing perhaps a lot more people in a smaller per foot square than in other areas. So what you see in many of these cases, when COVID happened, it really impacted many companies from being able to function, right? Because, they were not used to having employees work remotely. And frankly, even if they did try to work remotely, a lot of even basic fundamentals from connectivity, etc., were impacted, right? Not to mention security. So I think sometimes if you look at the grand scheme of things, sometimes we are certainly very blessed and fortunate that we're able to leverage what we have. But more importantly, though, if we look or try to predict, again, prediction is going to be a difficult thing. Now that we've seen that people can actually work remotely, I think that's something that will stay, right? People are starting to figure, and companies are trying to figure out, how do I leverage this to my benefit, right? How can I get the best of both worlds? How can I have people working, employees working from anywhere, so that broadens my ability to recruit the best people out there for my company without them having to be concentrated at those few locations that my offices are. So to that extent, I think that's something that's also going to push us, right? It's pushing the boundaries, and that's going to help us or make us all think a lot deeper on how we need to provide security for these folks who are working out there, and also for the mothership, right? The corporate resources that we have.
Great. It's interesting. You both provided some comments that I would probably consider to be challenges, but I could infer some general advice as well from that. So, for example, Clarence, you said that one trend or phenomenon that you've seen here in Japan is that there's a lot of emphasis on having a very stringent policy at the expense of usability. So if you were to provide some advice to companies that are looking to maybe implement an authentication strategy or a zero trust framework, however you want to term it, or maybe redo their existing setup, what would be some of the top level advice that the both of you would provide to organizations, and whether they're startups or large companies?
Yeah, I certainly won't say that it's super simple to balance the two, right? I think in order to, as I mentioned with the passwordless thing, if you want to increase usability, you also need to do it securely and responsibly. So I think it's really go back and relook at we've got this thing called the zero trust maturity model from an identity perspective, which kind of maps out where you're at today and the nirvana that you want to get to. Obviously, the nirvana is my users are super happy, they can be very productive without being interrupted, but my security policy is also so flexible that I can dial up or dial down my risk appetite. I can implement controls in place. I can respond to things really quickly, right? I've got super visible. So that's kind of like the nirvana state you want to get to. But in the middle, it's really, have you got the platform in place to actually get there? Have you really looked at step one, unified who your users are? Do you know who they are? Do you know how they're being authenticated? Is there a consistent policy that you have across them, right? And then next is, how much do I know about my users and all their access attempts and all that? Do you have a data set, or do you have a way to collect metrics, information, or context of where they're coming from, what are they using, what are they trying to do? So enrich that whole decision-making process and have enough data that you now can be flexible, you now can be strict if you need to be strict. If you're under attack, of course, right? Forget about usability, protect your assets first. But if everything is working well, why are you inconveniencing your users, right? But for an organization to get there, you really need to put the right layers and foundation components in place. Otherwise, you're just really taking a gamble and say, hey, today is Monday, no one's going to hack us, make it more usable, right? Or, taking a wild swing at things. Anyway, that's my perspective, is really to look at things in a more structural, framework and maturity level, and putting the right things in place is how I would, recommend.
Absolutely. I totally agree with Clarence. I think people need to remember that zero trust is really a concept. It's not an off-the-shelf package that you can just buy from someone. And if people are saying that, don't believe them, right? It's about layering, so it's really about a best of breed in terms of technologies, right? To protect, to prioritize firstly, what you, and then figuring out a step on how you want to protect that. But also, I think if you think about it, I totally agree with Clarence's point that at the end of the day, if the perimeter is going to be very ill-defined, then the fallback position still goes back towards protecting the identity, right? And I think that's probably the single best fundamental step that you can take now, because that forms that basis of the entire zero trust architecture. So I think bear that in mind, when you implement something. Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to go into the questions from the audience now. Before I go into that, we may not have time to address all your questions, in which case we'll be sharing the contact details of Clarence and Jason in case you want to ask them anything else more specifically after we're done. And also, if you have any additional questions while we're starting to answer these, please put those into the Q&A box, and we'll try and address those. So just to kick things off, there was one question that really stood out to me from the chat, which I found very interesting, is in the What I Am department, what do you think about voice or facial recognition and deepfake technologies with regards to authentication? This I find very interesting, actually. So, how do you consider this as a challenge, and what are some of the solutions to addressing those at the moment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think if you asked me that about 8 years ago, or I would say that the voice authentication was like the big trend back then, and there was it was cheaper to implement. There was quite a few effective solutions out there. But face-based recognition in the last couple of years have really taken off, hasn't it? Again, it's a lot more support from the device vendors, the OS platforms and all that to enable that. So the face rec stuff is actually more popular a factor these days that I'm seeing. However, what you raised there around the deepfake stuff, that's classic what we're talking about here, because for every factor that you have, there's always going to be techniques to overcome it. That's why the multi-factor thing becomes important. And that's why you don't just put too much dependency on the one factor. You responsibly enable this, and you, from a zero trust perspective, assess whether or not it's in a safe and risk mitigated environment that you can enable this. And there's another technique around continuous authentication, where how do you then, after the initial auth, detect whether there's any anomalies with that request, whether, hey, are they coming in from a new place? Are they, they've never logged on from, they live in Tokyo, but they never logged on from Romania or other countries before, and why are they all of a sudden logging on from that place? So that's a risk factor, increase. Or what are they actually doing in the session? Could you trigger a second factor, maybe a password, right? Anyway, I think that's an interesting question, but it's an evolving space around biometrics and things. But again, just because it's a biometric factor doesn't make it any more secure.
Yeah, absolutely. Just adding to that as well. I think the key point here is really not to trust on one single factor, but it's also the context, right? There's a lot of other signals that you can potentially get. Obviously the impossible travel, right? That he's supposed to be in Japan, but right now he's logging in from somewhere else, Singapore, Romania. That's one signal or a flag that you should consider. The other thing that it's also not always static, right? So if I can use a banking application as a scenario, so if I'm logging in as Jason and I'm trying to check on my account to see how much money I have, which is frankly very little, there's probably not too much security checks they want to do, right? So maybe the standard username and password would probably suffice. But if I'm trying to transfer money to Clarence, as an example, Then there's a little bit more concern because now there's actually a transfer of funds, or I'm actually touching touching the cash, right? And that's where you might want to have additional adaptive, what the industry calls adaptive MFA, or adaptive and additional checks to make sure that Jason is really who he says he is. And yes, you might rely on biometrics, but you can also have increasingly other ways of ensuring that or to doubly confirm that Jason is really who he says he is, right? So I think if you put that together, I think the reliance is, it's always going to be a cat and mouse game, but I think it's worthwhile thinking through all these potential scenarios that can happen and working out beforehand, right, how you would handle each of this so that it'll be, frictionless to your customer.
Yeah, no, I agree with that idea, especially because these types of approaches are becoming more scalable. There's even a lot of amateur videos you can see of deep fakes and fake voice and that sort of thing, and that's it's scary, but at the same time it's it's worth thinking about. I'm just going to go now to a couple of questions we had in the Q&A. So one is specifically for Okta. So it says, how do you see the Japan market, which is quite siloed, where quite siloed domestic applications, split authentication, independent to each other, and there's no one ID repository established. I don't know if Jason, you can add to that as well, but yeah, this seems to be specific for.
I think firstly, it's not just the Japan market. I think that summarizes the cloud market in general, and the rise of cloud adoption and the all these SaaS adoption that we're seeing accelerating out there. There's actually a lot more silos of authentication happening, and that's why that's where Okta comes in, right? That we can actually build a trust between Okta and those applications, so that you authenticate once with Okta, you pick your identity repository of choice, and you can single sign on to the different applications. And just on that note, though, if you're signing up to an application that doesn't support things like SAML, single sign-on, or some of those modern protocols, you really have to review your adoption policy and your cloud selection policy, because these are like table stakes these days. A real application that doesn't support those kind of standards really is not worth investing the resources in. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's a very typical environment. So you want to reduce the password storage and and then go for things like single sign-on to actually mitigate those risks.
Okay, yeah. Great. Jason, is there anything you want to add to that, or can we go to the next question?
Sure. I mean, I think it's there are platforms and there are solutions out there, right? Because if it's a distributed environment, you might have different directories, etc., where you're storing all these credentials. There are, I'm sure many of these platforms do support what they call account linking, right? But it's something that you have to do very carefully. Because if you have the know-how and if you know that this is the same user that happens to reside in two different applications or two different directories, it is possible to link them together. But again, it's also a risky move if you don't or can't establish that these two users are the same person but happen to have the same name or similar characteristics. Then it's probably unsafe to link these accounts together. But there are some techniques and capabilities out there, right, to do this. Yeah.
And there's also other techniques like, for example, Okta's got a password vaulting. So even if the application doesn't support, SAML and other type of single sign-on, you can always password vault into it as well, so that you're not managing your passwords in the SaaS. It might be a randomized, password and so forth, but there's also a question around the password managers in there, which I'll kind of dovetail in. So whilst they help, you're still relying on passwords as a factor, and it's still it's a bit like a lipstick on the pig, I think. Sorry for a lack of a better word. It does help, so you can randomize passwords, and you can not have your password copied in other non-secure systems, but it only helps to a certain degree.
Yeah, no, thanks for answering that question about the password manager. I was going to bring that up because I mean, at least from my perspective, what I find interesting of authentication is, I don't know, there seems to be very different standards for what you expect for an individual where it comes to like personal accounts, and then what you expect, for example, an organization. In my opinion, there should be an equal playing field there, given that, what an individual has access to now, where their personal devices is just as important. So I think leveling that playing field is something that I would like to see. I would like to have enterprise grade authentication with a lot of the personal apps that I use. Yeah, and just I don't know if you want to add anything else related to that topic of password management, or.
Yeah, I just wanted to add. I mean, it's layers and layers of obstacles, right? If you don't modernize some of these different integrations, because if you're relying on a password manager, then you're linking from, your authentication to that is really just a password-based auth, right? Versus if you're looking at a more modern and standards-based authentication like single sign-on using SAML or OpenID Connect or some of those things. Things are evolving very quickly. So Salesforce today is mandating everyone uses MFA, right, to log in. If you've got MFA turned on, you're set. Otherwise, more and more these apps will follow suit, right? But applications now are not just expecting a username to come through. So in a typical single sign-on scenario, application will delegate the auth to the identity provider. After you authenticate it, we'll get your username assertion back here and you're logged in. These days, there's a lot more progress towards things like, don't just tell me who the user is, tell me more about the user, maybe their role, their attributes about them, tell me how they've been authenticated, or tell me their authentication level. So if you're looking at standards like open banking and other things that are evolving, it's not just the authentication that people are expecting, it's also how risky is this login? Have you actually MFA'd them? Have you actually done? There's actually a lot more context passed from the IDP to the app. And this is where if you don't modernize, you're not going to get a lot of these, advanced techniques that are available. Anyway, sorry, a bit passionate about that topic, you can tell.
Yeah, no, I can tell. Thanks for the additional comments on that. So we're coming down to the last 3 minutes, and before we close things off, I just wanted to see if there was anything that either of you wanted to share. You have any announcements related to your companies? I mean, I'll do the PR plug for you guys, but I know that you both work together, Okta and Secret Double Octopus do have a partnership integration, just so that everyone's aware. And if there's anything else you want to share specifically about activities in Japan, please, now's your 2 minutes, or anything you want to add as just a general takeaway, final thoughts for the discussion.
Sure, Clarence, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So we launched our Japan operations back in September last year. So we've been growing, very quickly in Japan, and hence, why we located here. So there's lots going on. We're ramping up the business and expanding a lot. We are not just looking at the zero trust space, so we're also doing things like customer identity, helping accelerate cloud applications and adoption and so forth. But we do have a lot of various different partnerships working with local vendors in Japan as well, whether it's SaaS apps or security vendors, and of course with Secret Double Octopus as well from a authentication standpoint, where they really come in to enhance the whole passwordless and some integration points to some of these like desktop systems and so forth that they provide that partnership on. So so we are big on partnerships, both technology as well as the local partnership in Japan. So Jason.
Yeah, I think for me, I just wanted to hammer home a point, right? Because passwordless could be something new for many people here. And I just wanted to, if I can, just share this animation. Let me just pull it up. And really explain a little bit of how that might work, right? In context of everything that we've done. So okay, I'm just letting the animation run, and then so essentially what you'll do is you key in your username. There's no longer a password, so end users don't have a password. The phone takes over where you do two-factor authentication, right? The first one having the phone, which is the first factor, clicking on accept. The second one being biometrics, in this case, a facial ID. And once you've authenticated, you can log in directly into your workstation, right? Be it a Mac, Windows, Linux, Chromebook, whatever. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is because, again, it's not passwordless alone, right? It's a layering of techniques. So it's passwordless, removing or eliminating the passwords from end users, but combining it with, what we know to be proven, right? MFA. So having additional factors of authentication to complete the entire cycle. And that's what I wanted to emphasize and underscore, right? If there's something you want to take away from this, this is it. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing that. I think being able to visualize that really helps to hammer home this idea that there are multiple factors, and when you get rid of passwords, that doesn't mean you're getting rid of the main and only factor that matters. So yeah, we've just hit the hour. So first of all, thank you so much, Clarence and Jason, for joining us. It's been an interesting discussion. Again, I think with these we could always go over time and talk more about this. Very pleased to have you both with us. Also, just so that the audience is aware, we will be sharing their contact information. So if you do want to reach out to them individually, please wait for that. Feel free to do so, or reach them separately on LinkedIn if you prefer. Just as an announcement, as Gino mentioned, we are quite keen, given the nature of the pandemic here in Tokyo, to do our next meetup possibly in person. So that if you are interested in this, please let us know. We want to gauge interest before we organize anything like that. Again, if you have any suggestions on topics, speakers, etc., we're always keen for ideas as well. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. Apologies for going over time by a couple of minutes, but thank you to all those that have kept with us throughout this discussion. And Gino, any final things you want to say?
No, I think you said it all. I think that was an awesome event, and I'm sure everybody who attended learned a lot. I know I did, and we appreciate Jason and Clarence taking time in their very busy days to join us and kind of give back to the community here in Tokyo. So yeah,
thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you.